All right. Our main speaker today is Miriam Camero. She is originally from Laredo and is a proud daughter of 2 Mexican immigrants. She attended UT Austin for her BSW in social work, has a BA in philosophy, and an MSW in clinical social work. She also received her JD from the University of Houston Law Center. She first became active in the immigrant community through her field placement at the Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid in Austin, where she also served as the first social work intern at UT Immigration and Domestic Violence Center. She's currently the Vice President for the Social Programs Department at RAICES, where she oversees the Case Management Program, Canopy Hotline, and Client Cash Assistance Program. Please welcome to the screen, Miriam Camero.
Hi, everyone. Alexis, thank you so much. I'd like to preface, I think I saw a sighting on Paige's screen. I have a cat and she's elderly. So if you hear, she kind of sounds like an infant crying. She's not. I'm not attending to an infant, but it is my elderly cat. And so I just would like to put that out there in case if that happens. But thank you guys so much for taking the time to come out and give me the opportunity to be able to speak to everybody. Today, I purposely labeled the presentation as migration is a human right, just because I feel that sometimes is a little bit lost with a lot of the climate that we have seen in the last couple of years. Well, really, honestly, probably decades. But one of the things I wanted to just go ahead and highlight is the organization that I work for. I am the Vice President of Social Programs. RAICES started back in 1986. And since then, we have grown into three main serving departments. One of them is our legal team, where we provide legal services. Another is our social programs department that has case management, a national hotline, client cash assistance, and a refugee resettlement site in San Antonio. Then our advocacy team helps us really promote and instill policy change, all while we're providing direct practice. And so we have offices located almost in every major city in Texas. We have our headquarters are located in San Antonio. And in fact, the office that the social programs department is located in is an old orphanage from the 1980s, I believe. It's a 3-story, very, very creepy looking house. No one ever wants to work on there past once the sun goes down. It gets really, really creepy. But we do have an office here in Houston. One of the beauties of our legal department is that we do offer walk-in consultations. So if you were to encounter someone who would be needing immigration services, I'll go ahead and pass along our contact information over to Lindsay to help disseminate this information. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get into it. I know that we're going to have a time for Q&A. If there is anything that needs, if for whatever reason I'm receiving any technical difficulties or what have you, please let me know and I'll be happy to readjust. All right. Are we good with the screen? Yes. Okay. Great, thank you. Okay, so I just did an overview of our organization. And also, Alexis, could you give me like a 5-minute warning of like, hey, you're taking too long?
Yes.
Okay, awesome, thank you. Then I kind of wanted to give a really good, quick, comprehensive, this isn't a very oversimplified way to really explain immigration, but just so you all know, I'm trying to be as comprehensive of just how things have become and where its current state is. So we'll go through the factors of forced migration, kind of giving a little bit of context as to what happens prior to the migration over to the United States. Then an overview of our immigration system. I'm particularly highlighting a family going through family detention. I will touch base a little bit on how adults go through detention process as well as unaccompanied minors. But I'm going to try to focus in on it just because that's kind of a really good comprehensive way of what both minors and adults also go through. Um, then talk about once they are awaiting their immigration case, what does their life look like in the United States? What are some of the current affairs and how can you remain in the know for this? So some of the factors with forced migration really boil down to pretty common four main topics that we see here. But one of them is abuse, discrimination, threat, and extortion. This by no means is a comprehensive way of boiling it down. There are many other factors, but for the sake of context, you'll be hearing me say that a lot just because I feel in order to get a whole comprehensive view of this, we would be much, a very long time to be able to cover that. But one of the main ones that we usually see from our youth are more based on the threat level and extortion level, where in Central America, recruitment for gangs really do start in earlier ages as the time goes on. We used to see it back in 2013. They would start between ages 12 to 15. Now we're seeing them as early as age 6. And so one of the typical scenarios that we see with our unaccompanied minors that come in is that they're walking to school. In order to walk to school, they have to cross 3 streets. And one of those streets is managed or heavily populated with a gang. And so in order not to be able to go to school, they would then always get pestered by them to a point where then it kind of goes into that threat level of, okay, well, if you're not going to join our gang, well, we may cause pretty serious harm on your mom or on a family member. And so that's how then it blows into this really, really dangerous situation to which causes them to come to the United States to really flee that, because it gets to a point where then now mom is getting extorted and potentially threatened. And then it really becomes a much bigger thing where you really can't escape, even if they were to relocate within their own country, that the gangs are so prevalent that they really do start communicating with one another on tracking an individual, which is a really no way to live. But other forms that we do see is domestic violence and trafficking. Most of the time, we know the traditional sense of what a trafficking migrant is, but I think one of the ones that we really do see within the US that isn't really quite talked about, and it's also legally speaking very, very hard to achieve, is that labor trafficking component. And in order to constitute labor trafficking, the person must not being paid and also have no ability to leave the situation. And so that's always been something that's been really hard for us, because a lot of the times we have seen trafficking cases that occur in home country, but they flee and then come to the United States. In order for it to be a trafficking case in the US, it had to be trafficking within the US grounds. So that gets really, really tricky for us, because either, like for instance, we had one really, really, my cat's already crying, boiling cases where the person was trafficked, she fled right on the border, but then we realized that she had fled right before the US. And so now we couldn't constitute it that she had actually crossed over into US grounds while being trafficked. But if she would have not fled at that moment, she probably would have been also trafficked in the US, which is not something you ever want to wish on anybody, but technicality speaking, it was a hard case for us to achieve that once it was going to happen. Other untraditional cases that we see but are pretty common are transportation providers or business owners within their home country. Most of the time they'll say, hey, you need to pay. It's essentially what we, a very fancy way of saying a service charge of, we will not pester you and we will not threaten you if you give us 30% of your profits that month. And so that makes it to where it spirals really into a lot of situations, because then they're not actually earning any money. they're having really hard time making ends meet. And then also you're really now starting to collaborate with them if you are in that situation. And it really gets to a point where the power dynamic is just, there is really no way to live. Now you are completely controlled by them. And so those are some of the other situations where they're pretty common, but they're not as common as we see with the others that were mentioned. And so a very, very, very simplified way to look at this is someone enters with a specific type of status into the US. And when I say status, it could be a visa holder, someone who is trying to find a limited legal pathway into the US. And if their visa allows them, they adjust to become a legal permanent resident, which is what we used to be called back in the day, green card. And then you adjust your status from then to a US citizenship status. This is the very, very, there are a lot of nuances that happen with this. But just to kind of give you into a visualization of how this typically happens, I'm going to show you next what are some of the pathways, because in order to become any sort of legal status in the US, there are only certain roads you can take or pathways that you can take. It's not a case-by-case basis. In essence, it is, but at the same time, there's only certain avenues that you can go through it. But I think just before I go into that component, I think one of the questions that we often hear a lot of the times is, well, why are there so many people undocumented? And I think that some of it has to do with absolutely that our system is a pretty difficult immigration system to achieve. And it's also very limited in the pathways of legalization. There's also a lot of punitive bars that have made it impossible for, if someone were to want to go into a specific pathway, they may not be able to do that. One of them is a deportation order or someone who overstays their visa. There can be like a 10-year bar from that. So even if someone wanted to get married after they overstayed their visa or what have you, they would have to wait 10 years in order to finally even be able to apply. Then the other thing too is that a lot of the times it is situated on familial family. So a new family coming in that has no one in the US that can petition for them, it's nearly impossible unless it is through a humanitarian route. But I think that a lot of it just has to do with the fact that the law itself is very antiquated, that absolutely probably needs to be revisited. And I'll touch a little bit about that on one of the RAICES' stance on what, so that, you know, the question always comes in, like, then what should it be? And so how we would want to shift into that is kind of towards the end of the presentation. But the way it boils down to it for the most part with immigration is employment, family, investment through diversity visa, which I'll talk about that in a second, immigration through investment, and humanitarian. So employment-based and family are pretty common, or are pretty self-explanatory. A family member is petitioned for you, or your employer is petitioning for you. Immigration through investment has changed throughout the years, and the amount has higher. So it's basically a person who wants to invest in the US economy, AKA probably start their own business, project, etc. And through there, the US will allow for them a status through that, but it is an extremely high threshold. I think the last time I saw the technicalities of it, because obviously none of our clients are going through this particular route by any means, I think it was like 150 million investment. I think it's gone up as years go by. But yeah, absolutely, we don't really see those clients, and I think they would probably hire private, much more expensive attorneys than what we offer. Investment through diversity visa is lottery. I have never met anybody who has gone through that. So basically, that is a program through the US in which they want to promote other countries that we do not have a strong presence into the US, a very, very limited amount of number. And so then you just put your name in the hat essentially and you get selected. It's a very few amount, every year, but I have never met anybody that has gone through or that has achieved status via just kind of like luck of the draw. But RAICES primarily does family-based and humanitarian causes, which just to give you an overview of some of the categories that we saw in 2017, I know it's a little bit outdated, is the majority are family-based. Then it goes to employment, refugees, and then the diversity visa, and then this other category. Other can be a lot of different, very specific nuances with immigration that might not be completely perfectly categorized into one. But before I kind of go into the work that we primarily do, I wanted to highlight just a little bit of how difficult it really is to petition for your own family member here in the US. It goes pretty vertical, meaning in the immediate family, it is easier to petition vertically, not so much horizontally or going down. And when I say that, is horizontally is when you have uncles, aunts, and then if you are petitioning for your parent, so to speak. So usually if the easiest way is if you're marrying someone or your child is here. And so they have these categories of 1, 2A, 2B. And so you can see the distinct nuances of it. It's a US citizen petitioning for a spouse, unmarried minor child, or their parents. The parents part, it gets really, really tricky. But they set caps every year as to how many we can allow throughout these particular petitions. And so as you see here, I labeled, this is a chart that they have listed, and because of these numerical limits, right now, someone who is an LPR, a legal permanent resident, who's petitioning for their spouse and minor children, let's do F1. US citizen petitioning for unmarried adult child from Mexico, they are barely processing their applications from 1998. So really backlogged, really having to catch up from these situations. And so this is why you see with at least family petitions, why it takes so long for this whole processing to happen. And so this is the bulk of what we do. With humanitarian forms of relief, we have refugees and asylum seekers. I'm going to take a moment here to explain the difference between the two, because in theory, or technically speaking, an asylum seeker is a refugee because they are fleeing their home country because their home country is persecuting them. But legally speaking, an asylum seeker and a refugee or asylee. An asylee is someone who has won their immigration case, but a refugee is technically, legally speaking, someone that the Department of State, they live in a country that the Department of State recognizes. And the biggest difference is that a refugee applies in their home country to become a refugee, once they then are assigned a refugee resettlement site like the one that we have in San Antonio, and once they come into the US, they already have a legal status attached to them. An asylum seeker is what we typically see with our Central American migrants, where they present themselves at the border, tell the immigration officer, I'm scared to go back to my country. I just fled it. And then they are barely starting their immigration case. So a refugee is, number one, the Department of State has to recognize their country as eligible to be able to apply for this. It's an application process. And once they arrive, they already have that legal status. And they already have a prescriptive federal program that allows for them to, which is what we do in San Antonio, give them cash assistance, employment, education, and location, already have like their apartment and everything ready for them. So that's a much more prescriptive program. What we see a lot of the times with our case management program here at RAICE is we deal with primarily asylum seekers that are barely awaiting a decision on their case, but they have fled their country from persecution. Other forms of humanitarian forms of relief are U visas, which are crime victims. The crime has to occur in the United States. Trafficking, which is again the traditional sense of human trafficking as well as labor trafficking. SIJS stands for Special Immigrant Juvenile Visa, which is what you primarily see with our unaccompanied minors, especially definitely that you've been seeing in the news as of late. The Violence Against Women's Act, the perpetrator who is the abuser has to be either a legal permanent resident or a US citizen. So that's a very kind of specific category. Deferred action for childhood arrivals. This does not give them any sort of status, at least no pathway to citizenship, but it does allow them to be here. Temporary protective status, which a lot of our Central American migrants had been here since, I believe, 2001 due to a natural disaster that was going on. But other countries that can be like Nicaragua and what have you, the US has to deem their country as the country cannot adequately protect or provide for their citizens. So they allow them temporary protective status, AKA temporary stay here in the US. Due to a natural disaster, extraordinary conditions, or an armed conflict. There has been a pause during the Trump administration for Central American and several other countries that have really put a pause to this. And I believe, well, the hope is that the Biden administration maybe revisits this. He did put out a executive order to initiate a commission for it, but no active decisions have been made on it. And then the special immigrant visa. We see a lot of these clients that are individuals who assisted our military during war. So one example is a translator, an Afghani translator who is working for the US military. He's a civilian from Afghanistan, but he is assisting our military in translating anything specifically. I think that's sometimes we've seen that. I've seen it in several like TV shows and what have you, just to kind of give you insight. But kind of going back to an asylum seeker, I wanted to go ahead and just give you kind of an idea of the struggles that happen with applying for asylum here in the US. It is not an easy process, and it really is running on the contingent that really isn't setting themselves up for success by any stretch of the matter, in the sense that logistically it is hard for them to have a pretty sustainable life throughout while they are awaiting a decision from an immigration judge or from from immigration in general. So here's an example of someone who is coming in. They present themselves at the, I chose Laredo border, just considering the fact that I'm from Laredo, on the 2nd of December of 2020. They have 1 year from the date of from their first day in the US to apply for asylum. So that would mean 12/2/2021, they have to apply and submit an application. But let's just play with the fact that they submitted it a month later. And from the date of their application, they then have 150 days to wait until they can get a worker's permit. And that starts what we call the asylum clock. There can be pauses within the asylum clock. And one of them is if they transfer their case to another court, but the time between that transfer or that submission of that motion, that can then kind of pause it, and then you restart it again once that goes, but it elongates the 150 days. And so that means then from the time that they are here in the US, they have to wait a pretty substantial amount of time to even be able to work. And so that really puts them in a very compromising position, because they either have to find someone, it puts them in a compromising position because you can't really earn money unless you come already with money, but that's kind of the whole reason why they didn't come, that it really becomes that kind of catch-22 of what's going on. So just to kind of give a highlight as to, once we get into post-release life, why why we provide as many services as we do. Okay, so this is a very, very oversimplified yet process. I'm going to try to speed through it, but this is essentially what happens. I will point out the differences in which how an unaccompanied minor would do it, just because that they do not go to detention centers, they go to children's shelters that's managed by a different agency, but it is still the same kind of concept. So let's say that family flees from home country, they get to the border, they tell us Customs and Border Protection officer that they are scared to return to their home country. This is where you see they then get into CBP custody, and this is exactly where you see the holding cells of the overpopulated shelters, or overpopulated, where you see children in foil blankets. The migrants, typically this part of the process is where they call them this is where they call this place the hielera or the perrera. The hielera means the freezer, and the reason is because it's notoriously known to be very, very, very cold in there. And they don't really, this is probably one of the worst experiences that a lot of our migrants face, or at least from their experience or their foretelling. They'll often give them just kind of that foil blanket that you see after you run a marathon, or they'll serve them very, very like cold food as well as cold water during it. And these are all testimonies from our clients. And so this is a really, really tough time. I think, this can last a week to 2 weeks within this holding cell. It can be within 24 hours too, but it gets a really unbearable situation, especially when you're coming from a very warm country and you get into this situation. It really, a lot of our kiddos end up with a lot of just like colds afterwards, because they've never really had exposure to constant AC the whole time. But all throughout this, they do, one thing to mention before I continue with this. So with them, there are 3 family detention centers in the US. 2 are located about an hour outside of San Antonio, and 1 is in Berks County, Pennsylvania. I have no idea why they chose those sites, but they did. And so the population within these family detention centers have changed throughout the years. Some of them, oh goodness. Okay, well, some of them have changed throughout the years. And so oftentimes they went from like mothers and children to fathers and children, etc. So, but basically they get a credible fear interview, AKA they try to make sure that they actually are scared to go back to their country. They get detained. Then once an officer does reach a decision on the credible fear interview, they then can either be released or they could be denied, and that means their deportation. But now we're into this realm of post-release life. And so just to give you guys some idea of this, these are some of the children that we've seen within the detention center. To me, it just, one of my experiences, these were all my clients, was like the child and mom entered into the country. It was like 4 or 5 in the morning, and they were doing intake. But like the fact that we're having to like photograph and ID these children throughout it, there are alternatives to detention that might be more humane than what there currently are. But post-release life, this is some of the things that we do for our clients. We do help them register for school, give them client cash assistance, AKA maybe rent or utility access, learning how to navigate the system, getting them access to medical care. In other words, ensuring that their basic necessities are met. This is our hotline. I will also provide this over to Lindsay to help if you do find someone who does need help and is a migrant. This is a national hotline, so this is not just restricted to Texas, but if you know anybody who is in need of that, they can go ahead and call this hotline. The only caveat is that we make sure that they leave a voicemail. And the reason we say that is because for domestic violence reasons, we do not give them a call back if they just called. But current state of affairs, which I know that we can possibly come into the question and answer portion. But since the Trump administration, they have lifted the migrant protection policy. The migrant protection policy made migrants wait on the Mexican side of the border as they awaited their entire case. This started back in 2018. So the reason you see a huge influx of migrants coming in is because they haven't been able to cross or at least await their case in the US since 2018. So this explains a whole lot of situations that are happening. Unaccompanied minors as well. We've seen recently, at least in the Houston area, how they are in such high numbers that they have enacted FEMA to instruct these shelters. I will prompt a question for unaccompanied minors in the question and answer if you'd like. And then our refugee resettlement. During the Trump administration, we went from back in 2014 to 2016, around 70 to 80 admission of refugees a year. During the Trump administration, we went all the way down to 15. And what we're currently going through in the last couple of weeks in the news is pushing Biden to really up that number, since it's a drastically unprecedented low number since the previous administration. But all of this to say, Migrant Justice Platform, that is the platform in which several nonprofits have put in as this is our utopian ideal. This is what I think needs to be changed, because you hear all these problems, you hear all the problems that happen with a broken immigration system. But I think for me, one of the things that is worth asking is, okay, well, what do you do about it? And so obviously there's no one blanket rule. Some of it has to do with foreign affairs, others have to do with our current actual changes within the policy. And so those are, if you ever want to peek into that, please, I would highly suggest that you do. It's also located on our website, which is raicestexas.org. If you would ever like to volunteer with us, for right now, we have paused volunteer face-to-face type of assistance, considering due to COVID concerns. But if there's any time that you would want to just be kept in the know, please feel free to volunteer with us. And I believe that I'm sure there are questions, but I will punt it off back to Alexis for the discussion groups, and then we can go into the question and answer.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right. So if you've been with us before, you know Abhishek will send you, you'll get a pop-up saying you can join a breakout room, and you can either hit join or later, and you can always join later and use the time to go to the bathroom, refill your coffee. And especially if you're joining us on Facebook Live, it's a great chance to put your questions into the box so we can get them over here to Miriam afterwards. But before we go into the breakout rooms, I also wanted to highlight the fact that we had our volunteer event at the Houston Food Bank yesterday. So we had about 7 people show up, great event. I think everyone had a good time. Great to be able to kind of get out and volunteer again. And we'll have more volunteer events coming up soon. And so with that, we'll go ahead and go out into our breakout rooms before coming back for some Q&A. All right, welcome back. Okay, we've got a couple questions here in the chat. I'm hoping a conversation happened during the breakout rooms. But we'll go ahead and get started with a question from Bob. What % of migrants are economic versus seeking asylum?
I don't have the exact one, but I also think that not everyone who is here trying to seek economic gain is applying for asylum. But I also think that every asylum seeker is at some point trying to make a life for themselves here in the US for a personal economic gain to sustain their family. But yeah, I mean, I think that that's been one of the things that we typically run into, especially with our clients, is trying to really identify what that, and we were just talking about this also in our previous breakout room, is a lot of the times when someone has experienced such severe trauma in their life, they first talk about what they need, but not necessarily why they need it, which this application and this whole immigration process really asks them the why. And they actually ask you to do it in a very concise, comprehensive way, when in which you're just like, I don't know what to do. Like that credible fear interview that I was telling you about, that's always the Achilles heel for our immigration cases, because they have not gotten any sort of consult from an attorney by that point. So imagine me to ask you, hey, list me all of your problems in your life. Go, you have 10 minutes. You're not gonna be able to, you're gonna be jumbling between like adolescence and like, you know, where you currently are, to then, oh no, well, I'm not sure how I feel about this. And then suddenly you're having to really know how to be your best advocate. But to go back to what we were saying though, sometimes they will say, I am here because I need a better life. I need a job. But what they don't say is, but I'm being threatened because I was a business owner back in my home country, and I was already been shot at 3 times. But they don't know that that's the actual story that they need to tell, and not that economic component to it.
All right. Next question is from Elle on Facebook. Is anything being done to update the backlog to ensure that all are processed accurately into the system to decrease that timeline?
Yes and no. They have increased the amount of immigration judges that are currently serving. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's a good thing, though, because the actual law is very antiquated. To put it into perspective, the Immigration Naturalization Act used to be housed under the Department of Justice, and it is now housed under the Department of Homeland Security. And so instead of in the law, it references the Attorney General as opposed to the Secretary. And so to me, I'm like, you know, it really is a law that needs to be revisited. So even if there is a backlog and an increase of trying to process cases as fast as possible, it is still on this premise of a law that really should be revisited.
All right. It's not quite a question, but I'm going to tweak it into a question. You know, immigration happens a lot of times due to the local threats where they're coming from. Is there anything that we should be doing to help improve the physical and economic security of those local governments?
Yeah, I think with immigration, one of the things that come into a solution, you cannot talk about what's happening internally without talking about what's happening in their countries. I think the first hurdle that I think we have, and this is my personal opinion, is trying to build awareness of what this system is, what is going on over there, and trying to build an understanding of it first. As far as trying to help internationally, I am not sure. I think that might be something that could either be religiously based or within a nonprofit that does have services over there. That might be something better to explore that way. But I do think that having that building, that understanding within our society to begin with, I think is a really good way to do that too.
Awesome. How do you respond to those who say, well, immigration is a right, sure, but defending one's territory is also a right, and there's a duty to protect the citizens?
I think that over the last couple of decades, immigration just to put into perspective, it used to be where the narrative really did change from almost a welcoming component to then suddenly it's become very security based. And that doesn't necessarily mean that that's a wrong way to go about it. But I do think that there can be a world in which they both can coexist, of embracing migration as well as coexisting a precaution and measures for security matters. As we very, very grimly saw throughout these last couple of years, how important security is, it is also equally important to really identify who are these vulnerable populations that have that need, that very, very dire need to really relocate themselves into our country.
Next question. Why do they keep the detainees so cold? Is it deliberate or is it
You know, we've never had that. So there's something called the Freedom of Information Act, and in fact, and so that's a request that you can give the government it's built on the premise that it's supposed to be transparency, to build transparency between operations that are happening, not just in an immigration setting. This could be for a multitude of things. We once asked for a FOIA request for their air conditioning bill because I was like, if they're down on the border, like to run, I mean, all of us know, even here in Houston, like it must be a crazy expensive bill. Well, what the Freedom of Information Act also does is that it can also put big, huge, like kind of blocks over sensitive information that is for the security of the country. And so I don't know why that is. I would still like to also know why, but we couldn't figure out, we could not see what the actual bill or the wattage or any of that was. It was just basically was like a bill, and that was it, like, but without any of the content that you could see. I would presume it's probably to contain uh, a health concern, to try to make sure that viruses and diseases aren't being spread. That's my assumption, but there isn't an outright like, well, this is why we do this type of statement, at least as far as I don't know.
It might also just be a blind spot of, I'm hot, so let's turn the AC up.
I doubt it. There's too many that have the exact same characteristics. But yes, I agree. My partner and I he always thinks it's much hotter than it is.
All right. Next question. How often are the laws changed? Is it a moving target situation or something else?
So this is congressionally based. The president does have the ability to do executive orders, but at the end of the day, reformation of the actual act, it does lie within Congress. They do change very often. They obviously change from executive administration to another administration. They also have a lot of different addendums. So for instance, the special immigrant juvenile status, that really was a pretty new, not completely new, but I would probably say, I think it was 2007 when they first started it. And that allowed unaccompanied minors, at least a specific type of protection for unaccompanied minors due to an influx a couple of years ago. So there are different addendums that can be added as things are happening contextually, but as far as the actual law itself, a complete reformation of it hasn't been revisited for quite some time.
All right. Another question, have technology solutions to detainment ever been considered? Something like an ankle tracking bracelet as an option if the applicant has someone to support them?
So currently they do have ankle monitors attached to them. To be very honest, it is one of the most inhumane things I've seen. Again, that is my opinion, especially when someone hasn't exposed themselves as a flight risk whatsoever. To put into perspective, we all know Harvey. I'm sure all of us are familiar with what happened a couple of years ago. We had clients that were submerged underwater, or their ankles were underwater for a substantial period of time. We had no idea if they were going to get electrocuted or not. It's really invasive of how it is. They have to recharge their battery every 4 hours. So that means the person never really gets a full night of rest ever. The only time they've ever removed them is if someone gets pregnant. Otherwise, and even then they won't remove them until they actually have developed some sort of like swell in their ankles. And they also are required outside of that. They can't travel within 75 miles of where they're currently at. And also they have to go to their ISAP office almost every other week, which if someone's living in like Southwest Houston, it's by the airport, but for someone who doesn't have a car, that can be like a 3-hour bus ride of like so many exchanges and stuff. So the alternative to detention that we've typically seen that has been very successful is a case management system. So it's someone who does make sure kind of what we do with help meet basic necessities, but also ensures compliance to ensure that if they are needing to go to attend their court hearing or what have you, that there is that. They have had pilots, including ICE has done a pilot with it before. And I think they had like 98% of their participants be compliant with their immigration case. Also, to hold someone in a detention center, it typically costs about $380 a person per day. With the case management system, it's $75 per family per day.
All right, and then last question, I'm actually going to merge two questions. How do your clients get from the border to your offices? Is there any information about RAICES on the other side of the border so people can know ahead of time to get in contact with you?
We try to work with migrant shelters as much as possible. We've only been able to be successful, or we've only had one project one time. It was during back in 2018 where we were able to actually be in Tijuana beforehand. So it was a very cool experience to almost play offense as opposed to just defense in that instance. But the way they get our numbers is, number one, we are the detention centers, so they do have our first exposure there. The other is every person that has an open immigration case does have a list of free nonprofits that do provide legal services to immigrants. Now, that is to say that the majority of them are most of the time at capacity, which is why we do our low bono, pro bono, fixed cost walk-in consultation. So at the very least, they can get the ball rolling. But it is harder said than done. We wish we could be able to represent everybody, but also immigration cases in the past also could be, several years long. So to have such heavy caseloads for such a long time really put a damper onto, really make it logistically very difficult for nonprofits to take on everybody's cases.
I guess just kind of a clarifying question there. This will be the last question. You said it's only for people with open immigration cases or who are at the detainment centers. For people getting turned away at the border, do they have any access to your resources?
They do. So we do have with migrant shelters that are along on the other side, on the Mexican side. Typically, for the most part, there are migration routes that occur within Mexico on how what are some traditional stopping points. We do try to put our services out there, but we also don't have active employees out there. And so I think that there is one really great nonprofit that is in Tijuana, actually, it's called El Otro Lado, that is great because they do that. They do the prep beforehand. But it's also extremely hard to have a nonprofit that is both internationally based, or we haven't ventured into that quite yet. There is a little bit of logistical registration type stuff that has become a little bit hard.
Yep. Awesome. Well, great. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you guys so much. I will pass it off to the next person. This is a really, really fun exercise, and I'm really, really happy to be able to be part of this and answer any questions.
Well, like I said, thank you for being here. Great talk, fantastic information, very, very important work. Thank you everyone for being here this week. Special thank you to Miriam and Benjamin. We're glad you were all here today. We've got a lot of upcoming events. So before we head out, I want to let you all know that this coming week is a secular week of action. So starting April 30th, we've got tabling at Axelrod, May 5th, a food bank volunteer event, and then we're also putting together kits for the Houston Area Women's Center. So keep an eye out for future emails, Facebook, Meetup, however you keep in contact with us. And then you can join us again tonight for another coronavirus conversation, going for over a year strong now. So join us back on Zoom or Facebook Live, 8 p.m. See you tonight and stay safe out there, y'all.